Hello.
Hi, Rachel. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I'm sorry about the time mix up.
It might have been, it's probably me who messed up. Sometimes I don't always get it right. So is it 5 o'clock where you are now, or?
No, now it's a little after 5:30.
It's
So
5:30.
so it was just an hour off. It was no big deal.
Yeah, my apologies. My apologies. Well, I'm glad we worked it out. I'm glad. I was just doing some reading, and then I just popped to my emails, and I saw that you had popped on. I was like, oh my gosh, did I mess up? So yeah, my
No, I
apologies.
think it's just, time zones and daylight savings and all of that kind of stuff. So
Yes, things shift and change. Yes, awesome. Well, I'm glad that I'm glad that you still have time for us to meet. So perfect.
absolutely, absolutely.
So
Thank you
tell
for
me
making
about,
time.
yeah, where are you located?
I am in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Yes, very beautiful.
Yeah, and I just want to check in to see if this location is okay. I hope there's not too much ambient sound from
No, you're
the
coming
birds or the
through.
roosters.
Yes,
Okay, great.
no, very perfect. Actually, so I'm located on a coastal area in Australia. And I probably need to do what you're doing one day and sit out on my deck, because we've got views down to kind of distally to the ocean. But then we also have a farm, and I was almost going to be at the farm this morning, but I was like, oh, would there be too much sort of background noise with bellbirds and kookaburras? But I probably need to do that one day, just because it will be quite novel, I think,
Absolutely. As long as you're not experiencing floods or fires, which I know.
We've just been a little bit of the go in Australia right now. Yes.
Yeah, you really have. You really have. I have some folks that I consult with in Australia, and it's just I'm just like, oh my gosh, are you guys okay?
Yes, yeah. Talk about like environmental trauma between, all the bushfires that
Absolutely.
just ravaged the
Yeah.
country. And then, excuse me, I was something in my eye. And then, yes, we're actually located up in the region where we had all the floodings. Luckily, we have excuse me, I'm sorry, I got something in my eye.
It's quite all right.
Luckily we live in elevated land. Happens to happen when I might have to get it.
Do you need
I
do you
might
need
need
to
a
go?
moment. I might just need to
Absolutely.
just give me one moment
Yeah.
to put a dropper in my eye.
Yeah. I
Get
can see
something
it's getting
caught.
irritated.
Sorry.
Yeah. No problem. No problem.
Sorry about that. I wear contact lenses, and so when you get something little in your eye, it just seems to like escalate.
I've been there. I've been there. It's not fun. I actually have a very vivid memory as a child of having a little piece of dust in my eye, and just it was horrible. And when the doctor showed me what it was, but it was like, that's all. So I remember. Yeah.
So I just, before we get started, I want to say I've been to North Carolina, and it is absolutely just a beautiful part of the world. It's
where did you get to go?
So we've been through Chapel Hill. So I actually we lived in Florida for 23 years.
Oh, really?
And I used to work for integrated listening systems before Unite took them out. I was one of the instructors for the focus system.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we got to sort of travel across the country teaching. We did live trainings back then for training. So that's kind of my connection to to the company, and then we moved back to Australia 8 years ago, and then we sort of set up like a mini ILS here in Australia and do trainings, and then obviously when
Oh, nice.
they partnered with Stephen, we do trainings about polyvagal and safe and sound protocol here. So that's kind of my sort of connection to. And then I love sharing information. So I thought, why not start this podcast and share amazing information? And I know what we're going to talk about today is going to be just so important information for practitioners and for listeners to know about. So yeah, thank you for your time for talking about that, because eating disorders isn't an area that I know a lot about. So I'm very, very curious myself to unpack all the knowledge that you have to share. So I thought maybe before we get started is tell us a little bit about your journey to, because I know you have training in quite diverse areas, and so talk a little bit about your journey to develop the Embodied Recovery Institute, and then we'll talk about what that institute is.
Sure. So, my little elevator speech about my journey usually starts with this lifelong kind of blending of body and mind. Ever since I was very young, I was always moving and dancing, and that was like one passion. And then I remember telling my mother, I could have been, I don't know, 7 or 8, and say, I want to be a psychiatrist, And I didn't realize at that point that meant I had to go to medical school, and that took that off the table. But it's always been this, I think these two parts of who I am I've just been kind of going back and forth and immersing myself. So when I went to college, I started with a major in psychology, and then I did 2 years of that, and then I transferred schools and I studied dance for 2 years, and it was in that I think it was around that time that I had my first massage, my first professional, received my first professional massage, and had this incredible emotional experience. And I thought, whoa, this is really powerful. I mean, I've always known that the body expressed emotion, but I didn't understand how completely woven together they were until I had these experiences. And so after my undergraduate, I really was pretty immersed in a nonverbal world. I was teaching dance. I then went and got my certification in massage and therapeutic body work. And I just sort of stayed in that world where my primary languages were kinetic and tactile. And then I got to this place where I was realizing that the changes I was able to help facilitate for people, working with the hands-on work and the movement work, would get them just so far, and that there was another level I needed to go. I either needed to go more into the medical kind of mode, or I needed to really start to weave in more of the psychological realm and cognition and emotion. And so that's when I went and I got my degree, my graduate degree in counseling. And that was quite a shift, because I was going from sort of a very right-brained existence to this very left-brain, top-down treatment of the human experience. And that took me a little while to get used to. And I kept feeling like, okay, something is missing here. It's because it wasn't being woven together for me. And then I found sensory-motor psychotherapy. And the gift for me of that work was that it gave me the language. It helped me allow sort of the left brain, language-centered, cognitive part of my being to be in service to the right brain, and for the right brain to be able to be in service as opposed to be competing. And it gave me this bridge between these two worlds. And it focused on trauma and attachment, and how attachment injuries impact our development. And then where is the intersection between our responses that are defensive responses and our responses that are attachment responses. And it was through sensory-motor psychotherapy that I got involved with eating disorders. I was approached by an eating disorder treatment, residential and partial hospitalization program, because they were interested in working more with trauma. And so I started there while I was still doing my sensory-motor training. And as I was immersed in the way in which people were treating eating disorders, and these different maps and sort of ways of conceptualizing human experience, I started to weave that together and say, I think there's some important pieces that are being missed in how we're working with eating disorders. It's not to say that what we're doing isn't good, it's just not complete. And I had the good fortune of intersecting with Paula Scatoloni at the same treatment center. She was doing a movement class and I was working as a primary therapist, and I had developed what I called the Embodied Recovery group, which was starting to work with this somatic scaffold for attachment, which I think Porges would describe as that ability to identify and connect with safety, as well as what it is to distance, to separate from threat and danger, which would be our defense system. So I was kind of building that. Paula was there and she'd been studying somatic experiencing and sort of thinking about, well, how do we apply somatic experiencing to eating disorder treatment? And so we got together and we kind of looked at the Venn diagram of those two models, and then, augmented it more with the attachment piece. And that's sort of how the Embodied Recovery for Eating Disorders training program started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, lovely.
That was a very long elevator ride.
No. But it shows you just the merging and the thinking behind how we sort of do really need to blend that sort of body with mind. And I think polyvagal theory really helps sort of encompass that. So you've been working in the world of eating disorders for quite some time.
Probably since 2012, I think, was when I began.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so let's maybe just unravel, what is the current understanding of eating disorders? Right.
Well, I think it's evolving. Mm-hmm. So let me say that. When I started, it was eating disorders were conceptualized as what they call a biopsychosocial disorder, meaning that there were these components of our biology that created a predisposition for the development of eating disorders. And that then individual psychological tendencies, cognitions, the way in which we deal with emotion, blended with our social environment, are kind of what supports it and sets it off, right? Although, sometimes they would link it to the onset of adolescence, but it was like it had to be this perfect storm. Mm. And so there was this sense that there was some kind of predisposition for it, but they really were focusing on maybe there's a genetic predisposition, and the way in which you work with the body is primarily through feeding it, making sure that it's nourished, it's got enough nutrients in it, and through psychopharmacology. They were starting to bring in yoga. I think that's increased a lot more, is this idea that we can build the capacity to regulate in the moment
Mm-hmm.
through these mindful practices. But there wasn't really an understanding that the eating disorder behaviors may be driven primarily from our somatic scaffold that is impacting our individual psychology and our ability to engage socially, with what is available, as well as how resilient are we to injury and insult to those systems.
Which is
So
interesting. I was just doing just looking a little bit at, as to prepare for our meeting, and I found it quite interesting that there is quite a strong hereditary connection for people with eating disorders. So I thought that was interesting. But then, and you're talking about that systematic awareness, is that the research is speaking to that they have this sort of interoceptive hypersensitivity, which is kind of like impacting ability to focus, or kind of overwhelming, or then misreading those cues. So, when I read that, I'm like, I could see how having a somatic approach would definitely sort of help if they're having those sort of difficulties.
Absolutely. And I think that what was missing is a real thorough understanding of what does it mean? What is this bio part, right? That's one reason why the way we talk about it from the Embodied Recovery Lens is that we kind of want to expand that and talk about it not just sort of in biology or genetics, but just the whole way as a human being we engage somatically, right? And looking at the epigenetics as well as the genetics, looking at what is happening early on that is building these capacities to interact. So we're looking at what's happening in the birth, from conception through birth, through early life. How are the primitive reflexes integrated or established? Because they're what sets up the volitional movement. And it's kind of like getting all of that wiring on board, those reflexes that allow us to move away from stimulus or towards it, that allow us to expand or condense, and to do that in an organized way. So we have a full range of relational options, because that's what movement is. Movement is the language of relationship, right? It's the way the body experiences and communicates relationally. Yeah.
I'm curious with your lens of how you kind of look at the body, and with your background, and obviously at the time having a little bit where people's understanding was more of a behavioral approach, that the people with eating disorder had, that they were trying to diet, or their willpower was really high. I mean, obviously there's a lot of behavioral theories around eating disorders, but with this different kind of lens of looking at this body somatic, what kind of patterns did you notice? Any kind of patterns and presentations of the people, the clients you worked with?
Yeah. And I think what we might start with is that traditionally these behaviors were seen as sort of the reflections of, or the results of, how people thought about themselves, the cognitive beliefs that they held about themselves or about the world around them. And what we're doing is we're saying, well, actually, the behaviors are actually not, they are, from a bottom-up perspective, the behaviors are expressions of the body's way of speaking. It's not what we're saying about the body, but it's what the body is saying about our sense of safety. How is the physiology organized around safety? How much ventral vagal engagement is available. You know, where is their window of tolerance? How often can they stay within that window of tolerance with a ventral vagal engagement? Or, you know, is their neurology primarily in a sympathetic mode or in a parasympathetic dorsal state, or some combination of those two? And so what we started, so that's a big shift. That's like taking it 180 degrees, because what we're saying is, rather than trying to quiet the eating disorder voice or just eliminate the eating disorder behaviors, we actually want to listen to the eating disorder voice, listen to the behaviors, and start to decode them, right? And that's when you start talking, okay, so what are the patterns that we're seeing? So another difference is that traditionally eating disorders are sort of categorized by behaviors of restricting, binging, and purging, you know, some combination of those three behaviors. And so there's like, well, if you're restricting, we need to do this. If you're binging, we need to do this. If you're purging, we need to kind of do this, right? Or that these are ways of coping with emotions, as opposed to saying, well, actually, maybe these are actually kind of expressions of emotional states. They are, it's not that you're doing this instead of being, you know, angry or afraid. This is fear. This is grief. Let's listen to it. And I'm going to try and tie this in. I can kind of get a little tangential, but it does weave together. What I started to do was to take a map that I learned from sensory-motor psychotherapy, which is called the action cycle. And it looks at these different phases that we go through when we take action. And eating is a very, very complex action. It requires this first stage, which they call clarity. So in terms of eating, we have to first identify internally, am I hungry? Am I full? What am I hungry for? Am I thirsty or am I hungry? You know, I have to have a lot of interoceptive capacity to know that. Is this feeling I'm feeling inside anxiety or hunger? Is it thirst or hunger? Am I tired? You know, what is this that's happening? So that's the first phase. And if I don't have clarity on that, I can have any number of behaviors. I can restrict, I can binge, right? I might have very rigid food choices because I can't make decisions based on my internal sensations. So I just stick to a routine, right? As a way of getting nourishment in. I may, you know, not know when to eat. You know, so there's all these kinds of things, behaviors that may show up because I have what is called an insight barrier. Now, the next phase of action is, if I have clarity, then I take action, then I know what I want to do. And they call that effectiveness in this model. But what that requires is that I have enough support, both in my own body, to move and to move like forward, but also in my relational field, that what I want is supported. It's okay for me to take action. In terms of eating, that phase would be my ability to select food, ask for food, prepare food, plate food. You know, I'm taking action to get it, right? And that can be interrupted by all kinds of things. Diet culture can tell me what I want isn't okay, right? My ethnic culture can tell me that certain foods are or are not all right. But more than that, it can be it can be around other ways in which I show autonomy or what I want. Like, is it okay for me to say, I want to play the piano when no, you've got to go play sports? Or is it okay for me to have a particular sexual orientation, right? Like, these are all ways in which I'm starting to come into the world based on selecting what I want. If those things are interrupted, if I'm not supported in moving towards what I want, my body starts to get dysregulated when it comes to taking action based on what I need and want. And that's going to show up in my relationship with food. Now, the other thing that can happen on a much more reflexive or earlier somatic level is if I have difficulty with my primitive reflexes, if I can't cross the midline, right? Or if I have tactile sensitivities, preparing food might be really difficult. If I have sensory integration problems, going to a grocery store creates so much distress from a bottom-up perspective. And I may or may not have accurate cognition of why I'm feeling so bad. So I start to make up a reason given, what I've been told or what's available. Those are often where the eating disorder voices or thoughts come from, is that they are the best explanation I have for why going to the grocery store is unpleasant, or why I don't want to go out into a restaurant. It's like, oh, I don't like eating in front of people. Well, maybe it could be I can't stand the sound of other people chewing because I've got misophonia, right? And all of these things get kind of missed in traditional eating disorder treatment. So, but again, so those patterns of the inability to prepare food or select food could end up with restriction. I'm just not going to get anything. It's like too much, forget it. Or it can end up with binging because I'm going to go for what is acceptable or what is easy for me to get, even if it's not what I really need or want. And so we say, it takes a lot of pretzels to quench your thirst, right? Because what you're doing is you're just overriding you're creating an internal sensation that's louder than the hunger or louder than the thirst or the thing that you really want. So that fullness is loud enough that I'm not hearing the hunger that's not being fed. So to just say, well, we're going to treat binging or purging or restricting as one thing, it doesn't work because it's different places in the action cycle. And a big one comes in the next one, which is the taking in the food. Sometimes it's like, well, I can plate it. And this often happens with eating disorders. People will plate the food, but then when they get it on their plate, they can't take it in, or if they take it in, they can't keep it in. So it's that bringing it in piece. And that can come from ruptures in the social support, right? But it's reflected in the body, or it can also be in the body itself, right? This is where I think that panel that I was on with Paula, that I think maybe you heard, Dr. Porges asked this question: why don't they call eating disorders ingestion disorders? And when it comes to this phase of action, it really is about ingestion. It's, can I take it in, right? But all kinds of things can interfere, including sensitivities, tactile sensitivity, difficulty, with chewing and tasting and smell. All of these things can get very, very disruptive to the ability. And then, if we are running on a trauma physiology, then we don't have the ventral vagal support for digestion. And you're bringing food into a digestive system that's shut down. And that's really uncomfortable, really uncomfortable. So you were asking about patterns. There are a lot of patterns, but they're nuanced. And when we take this lens, we start to see, first we have to see where in the action cycle are the barriers, where are the behaviors, reflections of the physiology and the action cycle barriers. Once we know that, then we can start to see, okay, what support is missing that allows for the ventral vagal engagement and that sense of safety in each of these stages of action.
So interesting. Because I think I read also about, that when they do brain scans, that the reward centers of the brain around food are maladaptive in individuals with eating disorders as well. So I'm sure that probably fits into that, well, probably all the categories in terms of it's not rewarding to go out shopping, because obviously we can have a lot of those sensory strategies, but when it actually comes to sitting and eating, if that's not rewarding, on top of, obviously if you've got a lot of gastrointestinal digestive difficulties, well, then that sort of layers on top of how do I actually, find this whole experience, rewarding. So as you say, it is so multi-layered.
It's a lot of layers.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about, so my background is I'm actually an occupational therapist, and in my earlier career I was primarily a pediatric OT and trained in sensory integration. I'm certified in sensory integration therapy, so very much worked from that model. So when I first was introduced to Pat Ogden's work, I was like, oh my gosh, this is all occupational therapy, sensory integration work, but now we've just expanded it to a whole mental health arena, which is just so cool. But a lot of those strategies were strategies that, as a SIOT, that we implemented to help children regulate and be more aware of their bodies, but expanded to have that more psychotherapy component makes so much sense. But so we're in that sort of integrating some of that Pat Ogden's work, and then now you speak the polyvagal language. So how did you sort of weave or start to reframe or just merge polyvagal theory into your sort of working model of eating disorders?
Yeah. So I think the one other thread that helped with that weaving is the work of Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who was an occupational therapist, and she developed something called body-mind centering. And it's through her language of the developmental movement cycle or the relational cycle. That was a real thread, wove together the action cycle, the body, and attachment and safety. And where polyvagal theory comes in is that it is yet another language that tells us kind of what many of us have always known, which is relationships matter and our sense of safety matters. That particularly as mammals, when it comes to food, nourishment, eating, if we don't have a safe, attuned other, we're dead, right? We will not eat. As a mammal, we are completely helpless when we are born. We are dependent on relationship, right? And the ability to, and so the wiring, the fact, what polyvagal theory does so beautifully is it helps us understand that the neurology, the same nerves that govern digestion, that system is the one that helps us know if we're in a safe relationship with what's outside of us, that our inside and our outside are really connected through this ability to identify and then connect with safety. It's the same nervous system. And that's what I think polyvagal theory does so beautifully, that these are not parallel processes. It's not like, well, you have your relationship with food and then you have your relationship with people. It's the same thing. It's all the same. And so it follows the same rules. And that if we don't have the neurology that can pick up cues of safety, then it doesn't matter how much danger is or isn't present. And so this is one of the things I think is so important for, and I think Steve Porges does a beautiful job talking about this, is that safety isn't the absence of danger, right? There's a big difference between being protected and being safe. And a lot of times people use the word safe for both of those situations. But safe means that I'm separated from danger. I mean, protected means I'm separated from danger. Safe means I'm connected with something that's resonant, nourishing, attuned, supportive. And that's what polyvagal theory helps us understand on a physiological level, is that we have this system whose sole function is to say, can I connect with this safely? Do I need to disconnect from that? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you sort of unraveled that a little bit more. I can remember when I first sort of heard that concept, it sort of took me a little bit to kind of like really, really put all that together. And it makes no sense when you think about, you know, children who are in protective, services, when they're being removed from danger, like a predator, but yet they're putting into an environment that is supposedly safe, but there is no one there showing them any connection. They might be giving them food and clothes and shelter, but there's no felt sense of safety through connection. So they still are, their nervous system is still in this heightened threat protective state because they don't have connection with another. And so yes, no, you said that beautifully. I'm glad that you it's an important piece.
It's interesting that we're talking about connection, because right now our connection is,
I know, our connection just kind of just, that's the universe talking, isn't it? Yeah. Hopefully we're doing okay. So if somebody comes to you now with an eating disorder, what is like their journey through your kind of framework?
Sure. So I'm no longer working in a treatment program. So I just want to say that, although I have worked with some people who are working in that setting and did design a program at one point for one. So I think the first thing is there's a combination of things that we're doing. One is offering a new framework for how to think about what's going on. And one of the things that I have found is when we start to help people understand, one, the importance of their physiology, right? And that if their physiology isn't feeling safe and settled, then eating is going to be really, really difficult, right? And that there are all of these things that can make that difficult that have nothing to do with you're not thinking the right thing or not trying hard enough. It reduces the shame, for one thing. And that's huge, right? When we say, look, we aren't here to take something away from you, but to understand what's going on, that takes away a level of shame. One of the biggest...
I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment. And then, because biologically, it just makes so much sense when you think about survival. If you're not feeling safe, then your whole physiology is not set up to sit and eat, because you're in that
Absolutely.
Nothing about it makes sense. That why would you even have any inkling to even desire to want to eat when your biology is set up to, I'm in kind of survival mode right now.
Right. And one of the things that is unfortunately happens a lot is that because this can be a very lethal, it can be a lethal situation for people. And people are understandably frightened. Everyone around them is frightened. What they don't recognize is often they were frightened before the eating disorder developed as well. It's just that, but the field itself is very fear-based. And so in some ways, there's this attempt to scare people out of eating disorders, like saying, don't you see how serious this is? This could kill you. There's this urgency of you have to stop doing that and start doing this. But you cannot scare someone out of being afraid. It doesn't work. And we have to start listening to, oh, okay, if your body doesn't support this complex behavior of eating, which goes from, identifying, preparing, selecting, ingesting, eliminating, completing, metabolizing, all of these things. It's so complicated. If you don't have bottom-up support for it, right, then you're going to have to basically just dissociate in order to get the food in. But we're going to ask you to dissociate in a sort of socially acceptable way. Use, right? It just doesn't work. So the first thing we do is we say, rather than be afraid of this eating disorder, let's get curious. And we can only be curious if, as a provider ourselves, our system is regulated. So part of what we're starting with is trying to provide as much co-regulation as possible in the therapeutic relationship, and then helping people to identify where are their sources for co-regulation, right? But we're also, and so by doing that, we're looking at the sensory systems, like how do you relate to the world? What do you drawn to? What do you have, super sensitivities to, or you have low registry of? What movements are because it's a sensory motor system, what movements are regulating or dysregulating? What sensory input do you seek? Do you seek proprioceptive input, right? So are you somebody, I'm just shaking the camera as I'm demonstrating bounces your feet, or tends to fidget or tap? Do you move around a lot because you're trying to induce vestibular input, right? So sometimes these behaviors that are seen as disordered eating or eating disorder behaviors of this like compulsive movement has to do with the fact that they're seeking some kind of regulatory stimulus, but it's not really targeted and tailored enough to be like a real, what do they call it, a therapeutic dosage, right, of it. We've got it. I mean, this as an occupational therapist, I'm sure I'm speaking your language here, right? So we start to look at, what are the behaviors? When do those impulses show up? Where in the action cycle? And we start to give people another way of looking at it, and they start to go, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. And as they do that, when they aren't trying to squeeze a felt sense experience into a cognition that doesn't really match up, because it's incongruency that really irritates the nervous system. When they get a congruent cognition that goes with their sensory motor experience, they go, okay. And then change and treatment isn't as scary, because it's not about you're going to take away something. One of the things we talk about is that recovery is an additive process. We're not about taking anything away. I was working with somebody who purged, and there was a lot of hesitancy. She purged by vomiting. There was a hesitancy. Actually, a number of people I worked with this, where they were afraid I was going to tell them they had to stop purging. And I said, well, I don't want you to lose the inability to throw up, because if, pardon my language, if someone is feeding you shit, I want you to throw it up. Like, I don't want you to just take it because someone's giving it to you. You need to be able to have that. And you need to be able to recognize when actually what is being offered is nourishing, and it's okay for me to be nourished. That's been missing. So how do we do that is sort of what you're saying. So first, it's like some of it is psychoed, some of it is inviting a new cognition and seeing what's lands. Then it is experimenting with what can we add to the system that builds capacity for regulation. What's been missing? And sometimes we do a lot. I mean, you can see my office here. I've got a lot of sensory tools. I actually right now I'm using a weighted lap pad on my own legs, and so that's part of it, is helping them. We work with aromatherapy, anything that they can start to notice. Oh, wait, something is different when I'm in relationship with this, which builds respect and trust for the physiology. Right. So we're starting to build a more collaborative relationship with the self and the body, instead of it being this adversarial relationship. And one of the things that we talk about is we sort of these 4 principles, one of which is the body is a resource in recovery. It's not an obstacle to overcome. It's not the last thing we deal with, your body image. It's right there at the beginning, is shifting your relationship with your body, because it's a resource, and therefore we have to resource the body. But sometimes we have to nourish the body through sensory input before it can take on this very complex task of getting nourishment from food. We are nourished through energy that comes in so many different ways, through sound, through touch, through smell, through light, through love, right? Through gravity. And sometimes we have to nourish the system before it can then go through this incredibly difficult process of differentiating interoceptive signals, the motor that is responses that are required for selecting and preparing food, masticating, swallowing, digesting, metabolizing, eliminating, stopping. In order for someone to actually complete a task and rest, which we know is necessary for effective digestion, there has to be someplace safe for them to rest. They have to know that there are moments when they don't have to be doing something, that their acceptance and approval from others, their belonging in the world, is not based on their productivity. That sometimes it's okay to just be. And if we aren't nourishing their physiology, their psychology, their body, soul, and spirit with that relationship that says, yeah, you're welcome to just be here. You don't have to do anything. You belong. If there's nothing that's nourishing that, then that completion phase of action, that rest and digest part of the nervous system, never gets to engage, and would just go right into, and if that's not there, it's very hard to get real clear signals of what you want to do next. Most of the time we just bounce from doing to collapse. Do collapse.
So with this, this kind of different approach, more sort of body orientated attachment approach, what have you noticed where people tend to just sort of start to have a different relationship with food then? I mean,
right. Well, one of the first things they do is they go, oh wait, this eating disorder, this isn't about food, is it? And we go, no, this is not about food. This is not about food. It's about relationship. It's about the inside and the outside, my inside world and my outside world, how they're organized, how much safety, exists inside, how much inside, how much safety exists outside, and how do they relate. So that's one of the first things. And then I think what happens is, I mean, it's hard to say across the board because people are coming from so many different places, and there's so many different things that bring somebody to this moment of not being able to have an embodied relationship with safety and with food. But a lot of times when we're working with these different ways of building capacity, what people start to recognize is that their eating disorder symptoms and urges decrease, right? And it's just that all of a sudden something is easy when it wasn't before. I just was working with a client who went to a restaurant and said, I was anticipating it being really hard to select from a menu, but I knew what I wanted and I just thought, that's it, I want that. And it wasn't that we rehearsed or we practiced strategies or anything like that. What we were working on was much more on a developmental movement. How do you find your legs, right? And be able to integrate through your whole core and breathe and then reach forward. How do you reach forward from a supportive place? It's like, oh, wait, I can just do, it's right there. It's easy. I got it. Oh, that's all I need to do.
I mean, it makes, so much sense to me when you're sort of talking about working from this sort of perspective and shifting the thinking around keeping food diaries and, as you say, taking away the fear around eating. So it would be amazing if there was research that was being developed, because I know the eating disorders, the outcomes are, people relapse, that there's not good.
Absolutely.
Morbidity rates are quite high with
quite high.
Diagnoses of eating disorders compare what I was reading compared to many of the other mental health diagnoses. That eating disorders has the highest morbidity rate. So it sounds like getting this kind of approach, a more polyvagal embodied approach out there. I mean, so does your institute, we'll talk about your training as well, does your institute, is that part of that, is doing research as well?
We do not do research. We have had conversations with people, but we haven't had any research done yet. One of the challenges is that research requires sort of this very singular, very controlled study, and this particular, because this is so comprehensive and so broad, there's actually lots of research on all of the elements of this. There's research on mindful movement and regulation. There's research on the connection between prenatal and birth trauma and predispositions, or eating disorders later. There's research on sensory processing and what they call ARFID, which is avoidant and restrictive feeding, in feeding and intake disorder, which is very much what we would look at as anorexic behaviors, those restrictive behaviors, but it doesn't have the sort of egocentric body image distortions. It's not that people don't want to eat, it's that they don't have any desire to eat. There are other things that impede them, and there's research on connecting that with sensory processing disorder. So I mean, there's like elements, all of these different elements in it, but we've just woven a lot of that together.
Right. Which is often, we're complex beings, so we need to have a multi sort of faceted approach. And I certainly respect that everyone who walks through the door is such a complex presentation that programs need to be tweaked to accommodate that pathway to wellness. As I certainly get that. So I know research is challenging. So right now you have the Embodied Recovery Institute and provide training. So tell practitioners, so I'm sure practitioners listening will be finding this really interesting, and they've probably done bits and pieces of work, and having something that actually, like a training that actually brings all those pieces together.
So what we have is we have sort of this 3-tiered training program. The first tier is an introduction to all of these maps: the Polyvagal Theory, window of tolerance, action cycle, barriers, developmental, relational cycle of movement, all of these things, the sensory processing, that we kind of we've introduced these maps and how they're woven together, right? And with that, we're starting to build this language. What we're looking for is this central hub of language that the multidisciplinary team members can share, because how a yoga therapist is going to work with an insight barrier is going to be different than the family therapist. But we want to be able to say, we're both working on this. What is it to come expand into relationship with something? The yoga therapist may be doing it through, a plank and coming into the floor, whereas the family therapist might be saying, well, what is it for you to come forward and, tell your parent this thing, right? So, but it's both, how do we come forward and get clarity? So that's our tier 1, and we're developing also just some basic skills for working with the body, of course, and that is, we have an online and an in-person version of our introduction. Then our tier 2 takes different aspects, different maps, and we go and do deeper dives. So we have moving through the barriers, through the action cycle barriers training. We have one that's on sensory processing and autism. We have one that's on primitive reflexes and early cellular patterning, embryological patterning. And then Paula, who we've mentioned, is doing an experiential on using the Safe and Sound protocol, specifically with eating disorders, using this model. And that really fits into this is a great way to start to nourish the system. We have to nourish that nervous system through the use of sound and vibration. And then after that, there's a tier 3, which is an advanced skills for providers, and then 2 different group protocols on body image and also just a group for the embodied recovery for clients. So it's a training on how to facilitate those groups. So we've got a bunch of training. Some of them are still in development. So that's what we do.
Very cool. And I just want to clarify too, because we've been primarily talking about eating disorders, but your training at the Institute is a mental health orientated. So it's not just like practitioners come in because I want to work with eating disorders. So this is an approach, an embodied approach for working in a mental health arena.
I think that that's fair. It is called Embodied Recovery for Eating Disorders. However, eating disorders, like we said, it's not about the food, it's about relationship. Many of the people who've taken their classes, and it is designed for multidisciplinary teams. So we have dietitians, we have therapists, we have art therapists, we have OTs take it. We've had some yoga providers take it. So we have a lot of different perspectives in the trainings. And then there are people who say, I work mostly with addiction. This fits for that too, doesn't it? It's like, yeah, it does. This fits because it's trauma related. We are not training people how to be somatically oriented trauma therapists. But what we're saying is this is where this fits relative to trauma, particularly because we're working with the attachment system a lot. It's like, how do we build attachment, which is necessary to metabolize traumatic events, to fully metabolize them. So yeah, so there are a lot of different applications for it.
Very cool. And so we'll put links to the Institute in the show notes. And then, so if anyone wants to get in contact with you directly, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can do it through the Institute or through my email, which is rachel@embodiedrecovery.org. Yeah, so they can do it either way. Yeah.
Excellent.
Through the website or through that. Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge. And I learnt a lot as well. And I think I love what you've done of linking these approaches. And I think I would personally be interested to learn that approach. I think
You would be most welcome.
I've gone down I've gone down the technology side of in my career a lot. I do a lot of biofeedback, or I did my board certification in neurofeedback, and obviously still as an OT have a very sensory-motor approach. And use obviously safe and sound protocol and the focus system, and exactly like what you've done is have a very eclectic, sort of problem solving. How am I going to merge these technologies with body sort of therapy? So I love integrated approaches, because we are complex to have.
We are. And I hope that even if people just take the introduction as a way of understanding why we need to include these other people in the team, when we start to understand what is the importance of these other modalities, these other practices, and be able to say, okay, this person, they need to work with maybe an OT, maybe this person needs to do Tai Chi versus this person, maybe they really need to take up kickboxing, but like we need to like feed the body in different ways, and no one person can do that. And so even the traditional providers, if it gives them an understanding of why it's important to include the body in a more comprehensive way, I feel like that's huge.
Which just jumps to mind. I was actually doing a mentorship meeting last night, and we're talking about networking with other professionals in the area, but in particular, if neco practitioner who has a more sort of biomedical approach where we're really healing the gut, that because we know so much with individuals who have mental health challenges, and we know from a whole polyvagal perspective that there's a lot of digestive difficulties, and when we get gut dysbiosis, the whole gut-brain axis becomes compromised. And so is that something that you kind of touch on a little bit in your training? And
I would say we touch on it. Again, that is not my area of expertise. I think hopefully what we're saying is we have to be open to recognizing, that's a place. Like if we don't work with the microbiome, right, and help that, or sort of working with the nervous system in multiple ways to bring regulation and get that ready, then we're just asking people to swim upstream, and that's just not fair. It's just not fair. We need to be able to address all of those things, and particularly for people who maybe have had pervasive eating disorders where their microbiome, or they've had lots of medication, right, medical trauma that has thrown off their gut, and that was never really healed. Like of course there's going to be an aversion, right? Like exactly. Of course there. And if there's one other thing that I could just add, I think that does speak to polyvagal theory, is that I think what our training emphasizes is that the regulation of the provider is essential, that we cannot ask our clients to be doing something that we are not willing to be engaged in the process of doing. We don't have to have it all together, all the time. But this whole place of like kind of from my head to you over here, you do this deep breathing thing and get more regulation. If I'm not willing to do that, if I'm not willing to go on the embodiment journey, they're going to know that. And they're going to be like, wait a minute, I'm alone doing this thing. Forget it. You're just sitting there judging whether I've done it enough or not. No, we have to be willing. We have to be willing to go on that journey and show up as a regulated other. And that is our first intervention. That is our, sort of the first, the last, and everything in between. If we aren't doing that, then again, we're asking our clients to swim upstream.
Perfect. Did I? Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much. I just love it. And thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to, hopefully we can speak again in the future.
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you so much for the invitation and sharing your time with me. I really appreciate it.
I hope you all enjoyed my conversation with Rachel. I include in the show notes a brief summary of some of the key points or ideas that we discussed. I'll also have in the show notes a link to the Embodied Recovery Institute. If you like this episode or any other episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. I look forward to sharing more information in the future. All the best, Joanne.
If you'd like to learn more about the Safe and Sound Protocol in Australia and New Zealand, please contact Integrated Listening Australia. The website is integratedlistening.com.au. And for the rest of the world, please contact Unite Integrated Listening at integratedlistening.com. I want to do that again. If you'd like to learn more about the Safe and Sound Protocol, If you'd like to learn more about the Safe and Sound Protocol in Australia and New Zealand, please contact Integrated Listening Australia. The website is integratedlistening.com.au. And for the rest of the world, please contact Unite Integrated Listening at integratedlistening.com. I'm just going to do one last one. If you'd like to learn more about the Safe and Sound Protocol in Australia and New Zealand, please contact Integrated Listening Australia. The website is integratedlistening.com.au. And for the rest of the world, please contact Unite Integrated Listening at integratedlistening.com.